The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back, comfortably zoned with the Tokin Jew. Tokin, I might add. Although I'm in Alameda, and I may be the Tokin Jew in Alameda. As you know, my dear audience, I speak with the most interesting people on the planet on a regular basis. And returning to the microphone, to the airwaves, is Rabbi Ira Rosenfeld. How are you?
I'm all in all, I'm doing okay. Although I'll tell you right up front, you remind me of the old joke. I don't know why, where there's these two neighbors, and one neighbor always asks the other guy whenever they see each other, "Hey, how's it going? How you doing?" And the other guy always says, "Fine," or whatever. And like after years, the guy gets a little upset, and finally, next time he sees his neighbor, he says, "You know, I've been seeing you for years. Every time I see you, I ask you how you're doing, and you've never once asked me how I'm doing." And the guy says, "Wow, I'm sorry. How are you doing?" And the guy says, "Don't ask."
That's very good. You know my old expression, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So,
I've heard that. I didn't know it originated from you. By the way, I want to thank you for having me today. I know you, as you said, speak with some of the most interesting people in the world. I guess none of them were available today, but I'm glad that I could fill in for them in any event.
Well, it's a slow Thursday. We got an insurrection to report on today, and the most interesting people, actually the most interesting person, one of the most interesting people I know is you. So don't sell yourself short.
Nice to say. For most people, they're the most interesting person in their own mind. But to know that someone else says that's very, I really appreciate that. Especially coming from a Tokin Jew like that.
A Tokin Jew. I don't remember if we toked back in the days when we were aspiring comedians in the Bay Area together. You went on to some terrific success. I went on to podcasting. Well, you made a career.
I appreciate you saying that. I did get to travel. I basically got a free vacation.
Your big success was. Wait a minute. I want to tell you what your big success was.
Oh, okay,
meeting
sure.
your maid, and she got you off the road. I remember you telling me that.
You know, that is exactly how that went. You got that spot on. She was way ahead of me. I had no idea. When she was talking about all these things I could be doing in town, I didn't realize she was thinking, if I'm getting involved with this guy, I want him here in town, not out on the road.
Right. What did you like about the road, and what did you really hate? Well,
I got to say, what I loved about being on the road is I basically, in a way, it was almost like a free vacation for a few years. You know, I consider myself a little bit like a truck driver who brings deliveries, but instead of delivering things that I needed to drive a truck for, I could just show up and deliver the jokes. And that was, you know, at most, if I was headlining, would be like an hour a night, or maybe if there were 2 shows, 2. So the rest of the time, I got to travel all around the country, expenses paid. I actually was getting paid, sometimes more than others, and got to, you know, go around and travel the country. And for me, that was also great because I don't like to, I mean, I do like tourist attractions to some extent, but for the most part, when I visit towns, I want to know, like, what the real people who live there are like. So through doing stand-up, I was able to meet a lot of people, and sometimes they would invite me over. We'd go to parties. I mean, I have a lot of great stories of different people who were gracious enough to show me around the town so I could see the locals' view. So to have seen all that, and truthfully, I keep, you know, I'm a nostalgic person. Everywhere I go, I think, oh, what would it be like to live here? And at the end of it all, I got to be honest, it's a relatively short list of places that I would really consider living. And right here in California is pretty high up, if not number 1 on the list. Until the monthly bills come around, and I'm reminded how expensive it is.
I'm sorry. If you didn't live in California, where would you live?
All kidding aside, the only few places I would consider is I could see moving back to New York or the the tri-state area only, because I have family there. All the hassles and everything else, I'm not sure I would love, but I could see at some point being within that general area. Vancouver, British Columbia actually is a town I like a lot. I can see moving there. There's a few others that are somewhat on the radar, like if I happen to get a really good job to move up there. Portland, Oregon, possibly. In terms of retirement, which I hope to never have to do, I would like to be working till the very end. I would consider other places only because they're like really inexpensive places to live. I kind of joke, where I would want to live is Vancouver, Washington, not Vancouver, British Columbia. I wouldn't really actually do it, but I'll tell you why. Because the state of Washington has no property tax. And Vancouver, Washington is right at the,
I didn't know
right,
that.
and I look into these things. They're right on the border of Oregon and Portland town, and Oregon has no sales tax. So I could buy a house where I would not have to pay property tax and then just do all my shopping in Portland, and then I wouldn't pay sales tax. At my age, I start thinking about where I could start saving money. But then, as my wife keeps reminding me, yeah, but you'd be in that town. We'll see.
Right. What was the biggest adjustment for you from the East Coast to the West Coast?
That's a good question. Because I moved to San Francisco in many ways is sort of like a miniature New York. I mean, it has its own character. I don't mean to insult anybody from San Francisco or New York, but in that it's a little bit more like San Francisco is a smaller version of a more urban type of area where it's a little more crowded, has a little bit more of that European flavor than a lot of other areas that are big sprawls and open wide. And actually, that's what attracted me to San Francisco is I thought, okay, I can get used to this because, there's a lot of public transportation. There's a lot of traffic was not the thrilling part and no place to park. But those were things I was used to growing up in Brooklyn and spending time, in the boroughs, as it were. But the one big difference that really sold me was when I drove over the Golden Gate Bridge. And I realized, you can get out of this urban environment anytime you want with one short drive. Well, depending on traffic, but, one relatively short drive. New York, once you're in it, you got to drive for a while till you get out of the greater New York area. You might hit a couple of more suburban spots there and there, but until you're totally out of that, that's quite a truck. So those were the two things. I thought it was a lot like New York in that regard in terms of the flavor. And it's a city you didn't necessarily have to drive all the time. You can figure your way around doing walking. That I like a lot. I like being in the city. How about the people?
Ira, how about the people? Did you find the East Coast different than the West Coast?
Yeah, what? That's a great question. I think the attitude, here's what I say jokingly, but I think there's a lot of truth to. Like Californians are much more quick to say, wow, that's awesome. When in New York, if somebody goes, hey, yeah, that's not bad, that's basically their version of awesome.
Right.
But in New York, it goes, yeah, it wasn't bad. Like, hey, they're not complaining about it. They're not giving you a face or a finger. Then you're doing okay. So it's a lot more of a jaded environment, which I got a bit tired of, which is why I look to move out. But out here, a lot more people have that positive thing where they're willing to put their emotions out there and say, wow, cool, dude, awesome. I mean, it's a little overdone at times, Like if I happen to get a green light rather than a red light, that's nice, but I'm not sure that constitutes awesomeness. But you know what? All things being equal, I'd rather things be considered awesome than just, yeah, it's not bad.
Okay. Hey, humor me because I seem to have a baseball brain. Who did you grow up a fan of in New York? You had three.
Well, truthfully, I'll be honest. I got to thank my dad. My dad taught me a lot about sports. So growing up, I knew about baseball and football. Basketball, not as much. So I did know about it. But truthfully, I wasn't a huge sports fan growing up. I wasn't that invested to it. Because for me, baseball, and, no insult to people into baseball. I have a lot of good friends who love baseball. And a lot of it I get. Because that's like a pure, let's think about it. What are most kids doing, especially guys? I don't want to sound sexist, but, the average kid walking down the street, they see a stick, they want to pick it up and swing it. They see a rock, they want to pick it up and throw it, right?
Right.
They feel there's a little irritation down south, they want to adjust it, right? And when you grow up in New York.
Down south, they want to throw it at you.
Exactly. You want to find something to throw it at. And on top of that, in New York, people are very free to spit all the time. So this is what baseball is all about. It's this, you're swinging a stick, you're throwing a rock, you're adjusting yourself, you're spitting, and then occasionally in between all of that, there's a play. Well, let's be honest. I love the sport. I love watching the highlights, but I give a lot of credit to the color commentators in baseball. In baseball, you need a good color commentator because the play-by-play, by the time they're shaking their heads and doing the little finger movements, and then they throw the ball. So now they're playing catch between the pitcher and the catcher. So, that goes on for a while. Eventually, there might be some action on the field. So a good color commentator can fill that in with stories and background. The play-by-play in baseball, for me, seems a lot easier. He swung the ball. Oh, where did it go? That's where it landed. He caught it. Nice. Let's move on to the, it's a great sport. I got to say, one thing I always did I know it's not right. You're supposed to have to pick a team. But I'm one of those, when I like the sport, I like the sport. So there are teams that I root for. So I get the Yankees love because they have that, storied past. But I'm a big fan of the underdog. And for that reason, I like the Mets also. But I got to be honest, the Mets were more about Queens, and Yankees were more about the Bronx. And somehow, growing up in Brooklyn, it was just it was really hard to accept liking anything from Queens. I've gotten past that.
I can appreciate that, even though I grew up in Queens and originally from the Bronx. I had a myriad of relatives and friends in Brooklyn. And looking back, the boroughs, all my experience in New York growing up, the boroughs ran together. I have memories in all of them, and I don't think the people were that much different in the Bronx than they were in Brooklyn or Staten Island. There's a spirit of New York that supersedes the differences in the borough. In the boroughs, when there's an emergency, they all come together. I'm thinking of 911, 9LL, as my friends call it out here. And I really love that New York attitude, and it stays with you for the rest of your life. And
I hear you. I agree. And I know. Maybe I just, when I grew up, we were more territorial. But I will say that all of New York can. I say this jokingly, and it's exaggeration, of course. I want to make sure not to insult them. But I think all New Yorkers agree that New Jersey sucks. As long as you're not from New Jersey. But I admit this is all ludicrous because you're right. There's that general area and the vibe that goes with it, which, as much as people love talking about how rude New Yorkers are, and they may be right, there is a certain sense of connection. And with that rudeness, if you're going to buy into that, there's a sense of informality and sense that you can just speak your mind that I think is refreshing. The old joke where you have, two New Yorkers and they're saying, hey, screw you. And what they're really thinking is, let's do lunch. And in L.A., everybody's saying, let's do lunch. And what they're really thinking is...
Right.
So you know what? They're honest and candid. You got to give them that. And we all united against New Jersey. So I laugh about this when I look back because it's ludicrous. Anybody who knows a Brooklyn accent or a New Jersey accent, they're not that far apart. But yet growing up, it's like, oh, those freaking idiots in New Jersey. There are a bunch of freaking idiots there. I'm like, really? Like you're the big expert on the English language.
Exactly. I am somewhat of an expert on voice and voice quality, not just because you're a rabbi and a comedian, but your voice is very much like Jackie Mason was.
My voice is like Jackie Mason. That's a crazy thing to say. Who would say a thing like that?
Well,
I don't think
even without imitating him, it goes up and down, and you have a smile in your voice like Jackie did. Not just a smile, almost a a way of telling the audience that they're going to learn something from talking to you. What did you teach when you were a comedian? You weren't just a drop your pants, dirty joke comedian. What do you remember?
That's a great question. I'll tell you, I learned relatively early on. I was lucky. One thing I loved about starting my comedy career in San Francisco is there was a real sense of community there. I would hang out at the Holy City Zoo. That's where it all started for me. First I went to some shows and I got a spot, like the next to the last guy.
Right.
Like the old joke, there would be like one person left in the audience. I'm like, hey, thanks for sticking around. And the guy's like, oh, no, I'm going up next. And then, from there I was lucky to get pushed to a better spot and eventually hosted. And then some other guys who were like features or headliners said, hey, do you want to come and open for me here? And I kind of worked my way through the ranks. But hanging at the Holy City Zoo, no matter who showed up, from the national headliners, major stars, to the guys who were just getting started, we would hang out in the front or in the back. And there was a sense of community, and we'd get together and talk about our acts and say, oh, that's a good line. You might want to tweak this or do a callback from the other line and bring it in over there. It was really, I loved it. I don't remember if I talked about this with you the last time, but I was lucky to have met Robin Williams, not once but twice on the same night at the Holy City Zoo. And he was awesome. He came in, he was hanging out and joking with us just like everyone else. So
I got to open for him that once at the Holy City Zoo, and you hit it right on the head. He was just one of the guys.
Yeah, he hung out there. He was awesome.
He was awesome.
Just to address your question real quick before I go too far off on a tangent, which I've been known to do. I don't know that I was teaching specifically, but the one thing I learned relatively on is you got to be yourself. And I know it sounds self-indulgent, but to talk about how you relate to the world and hope that other people will then relate to that and find the humor in it. Because there's a lot of people who can tell a joke, but there's nothing that anyone's going to remember about you. They might remember the joke, and even if you tell it really well, you don't have like a hook, so to speak, or something that people will remember who you are. So I don't know that I was there to teach specifically, but I was, I would talk about how I look at things in my life. And I know it sounds very self-indulgent, but at the same time, I always tried to find the things that other people would also relate to. Because I started off as a musician. I always joke how I'm a lazy musician. Musician, first of all, you got to work for hours. For a comic, Guns and does his set, he's done for the night. And then the house band comes and they play for hours, making the same money. Plus, I was a drummer. I'm lugging drums around. I'm dealing with musicians. I have like thousands of dollars worth of equipment to make $50 a night. So then I realized, hey, for stand-up, I can make the same $50 to go and talk to everybody for 20 minutes. But I talked about my background. So I joked about music. I joked about growing up in New York. I joked about being a bachelor. The things that I related to in my world, and I found that was the best way to draw people in to who I was. Occasionally that would then lead into doing more standard type of just setup and punchline jokes, but it was within the framework of like, this is what I have to say about things. This is how I look at things. I think that's great advice if anybody's thinking of doing comedy. My number one advice is don't. But if you're crazy enough to do it, is to find your way of bringing your voice into it, not just to try to get the cheap laughs. And you mentioned dirty, by the way. I'm not a prude by any means. There are some comics who are filthy that I think are hilarious, but I'm not a big fan of getting the laughs just off of the shock value of the fact, like to let everyone know just how dirty and how filthy you can talk. That wasn't me. That would be forced if I did it. I would throw in a little entendre or a little bit of that, but that wasn't me. And I wasn't big on, insulting people. I would, I had my jokes ready to go in case someone heckled me. I had a few lines and would do that as needed, but it wasn't like my act. I had to, you got to find what works for you. And that wasn't for me. I'm not like the angry guy who, is looking for a fight with the audience. Other guys are great at it. If that's them, then good for them.
What did you learn from the audiences in the places that you entertained? doesn't have to be the audiences, the people you met maybe before the show, wandering around town. You were a New Yorker coming out. When you were first getting started, like everyone else, we all got bookings in places that were may have been only an hour out of San Francisco, but attitudinally, it was going from Modesto to Madeira to places that, although they were technically in California, they were a different breed of folks. What did you learn from? What did you learn from them?
I learned that. Yeah, I learned that. That's a great question. I've learned there's a saying in Hebrew.
That's the fourth time you've answered me with that. So if I have 4 great questions, I must be doing something right.
Well, all these very super interesting people you talk to, you have to have good questions for. So now you got them ready to go for me also.
Right. But I wasn't saying that putting you down or anything. I glowed when you said that. All 4 times.
I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I appreciate that you appreciate it.
Okay, and I appreciate that you appreciate that. What's the major differences between them and us? Let's put it that way.
Well, I can make this into a rabbinic moment. This is what I love about being a rabbi now. I no longer have to get laughs. So, like, if I get a laugh, great. If not, then I just turn it into a rabbinic moment. So there's a saying, "Gai lifnei mi ata omed," know before whom you stand. And usually that's a very solemn thing, like, you're standing before a power greater than yourself. I don't like the word God, way too much baggage. The history of violence in the world is always in the name of God, so I'm looking for a new term. But, know before whom you stand usually means, like, know that you're part of something greater than yourself and know that that's where you stand. But I also say know who you're talking to. That's why I always hated if I was running late and would show up for a gig the last minute because I didn't know who the people were. I always would like to be there as early as possible so I could just, if nothing else, hang out with some of the staff, at the place I was playing, just to chat with them a little bit, see, hey, what's the town everybody makes fun of over here, and get a flavor for what people relate to there and try to not totally rewrite my act, but to open up with a couple of little jokes about that town went a long way because that's how you got people on your side right from the start. You have to address what people appreciate, even if it wasn't the best joke ever, but just for them to know, hey, this is a nice little local reference to show that I did a little research there, that I have a connection there. Sometimes you can fake it. I know a ton of my friends who they have the same line every town they went to, but they would claim it was this line. Boy, this town's got some crazy drivers. You can go anywhere and everybody will think you're talking about their town.
Absolutely. That's very true. There are things that run true in every city, in every state. What are some of the things that surprised you? Where you go to a town and you say, wow, this isn't what I expected Podunk to be like, or, did you get, get a lot of surprises?
With that one. Every night's a different surprise. Especially, I admit, I did a ton of hell gigs, as we called them, where it wasn't always these nice clubs. I wanted to be working, and especially if I was like out of town, if I could tag on a few extra nights, where I was at a nice club for like a week and then I can tag on a few one-nighters within that general area, I would always try to do it. You know what? Every night is different. It's not only the town you're in, it's the people who happen to be there that night. It's what happened to have happened in that town that night. There's a lot of that. I just got to back up for a second because I want to share a little memory about why you got to relate. When I was in Florida one time, I ran into a New York comic, and he's complaining to me, these people here are a bunch of freaking idiots. I'm like, okay, you might be right, but why do you say that? Well, I'm doing my subway material. This stuff kills in New York, and I'm getting nothing here on it. And I'm thinking to myself, maybe, all right, they may or may not be idiots. I'm not going to argue that point, but the fact that they're not laughing about your jokes about the subways, They're in Florida. They might have heard of the subway. They might have visited and rode a subway once or twice, but they don't relate to the culture of riding the subway. That's material you do when you're in New York. You know, that would be like my doing all my Jewish humor with the nuances of people who know Judaism would find amusing, but someone who's heard of Jews but never really knew the culture, it's going to be funny to them. You got to be able to know the night, but it doesn't always work out that way. So what surprised me is, well, two things. One is some nights I've learned some nights are just not going to be your night. I mean, it's never happened to me personally, but from the comics I work with on the road, I looked at.
You never had a night when everybody didn't just stand up and applaud and go more.
No, that I've had. I'm not saying every time. No, I'm saying I never had a night where I had a hard time. No, I'm kidding. I've had. I like I said, I guess it gets back to what I said already. To answer your question, it's knowing what's going on. Some nights are just not going to be your night. There was one club, I forget where, in the Bay Area, where they had a rowdy crowd, and they would love booing people off the stage and start singing na 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 na, hey hey. It was brutal. They would be throwing ice on the stage and stuff. And I was relatively early in my career there, so when they that was one night I had a really hard time. I know I'm not answering your question directly, but you remind me a couple of nights that I had a tough time. So one time I was up in Canada on Vancouver Island in a little town, and it was like it was one of those nights that we just couldn't get the crowd to quiet down, and I didn't totally bomb, but I was having a really hard time getting their attention and really hard time getting good laughs on the stuff that I knew would be like tight. And afterwards I found out that the majority of the people in that town work at the mill. And that day they fired like a lot of people. So this was one of those one-nighter gigs where it was a bar that had a comedy night. And it turns out like half the people there had either been laid off or had a friend who was laid off. So they were just in a pissed off mood, just wanted to drink it off and vent with their friends, and like me being up there trying to do my cutesy clean act just was not flying with them. Right. So I'll tell you what has surprised me is, you know, we joke about how laid back some towns can be, but wow, I've been to a few where I was like, wow, they weren't kidding. These guys are laid back. I mean, I had an okay time, but I had to really learn to slow myself down and work with their pace. I was in some little town in Colorado one time. These people were like borderline comatose. I mean, they were nice people and all, and they liked me. They laughed at my jokes, but their pacing and the way they carried themselves, like as a New Yorker, it just drove me nuts. I had to like really hit the brakes and do everything in super slow motion and then take extra long pauses so that they can like keep up with me. I always joked about it, but when it actually came true, it was like, wow. Okay. I'll tell you the other thing that surprised me. It really relates to, there was a bit that Eddie Murphy used to do about, like, the first time he started to travel around the country, like he was just looking for racism everywhere, you know, to the point that, like, people would say innocent things and he'd, like, fly off the handle. Like, a guy would say, excuse me, sir, is that your bag? And he'd be like, what? Yes, that's my bag. What's the matter? A black man can't have a bag now? So I was just a little like that, being the token Jew. And you can spell it however you want. Where I came into a lot of areas, like the first time I went to Texas, the first time I went into the deep south, I was like, wow, this is, I thought I would confront a lot more anti-Semitism than I did, truthfully. I've had a couple of little things on the road but for the most part, it was a lot less than I thought. Most people were really nice. With a name like Ira Rosenfeld, it was no secret that right. I was in Texas in a small town. So after the gig came up to me and he says, so I got to ask y'all, this thing about being Jewish is like, are you really Jewish or is that just like part of your act? Like, this guy clearly hasn't been around a lot of New York Jews in his life if he had to actually ask that question.
Yeah, or many people that would adjust their lives to their comic career. I'm a comedian now. Let's see, I'll be Jewish. So
yeah, well, you know that Jews have a reputation for being funny and for running showbiz and for liking to complain. That's perfect. Those are all the things I'd love to do with my life. Why not?
Okay. I want to ask you, Ira, did you have day jobs when you were learning, when you were going through it? And how did you do at, I call them just fillers to keep alive?
Or as I like to say, a little employment in between my professional engagements. Yeah, I am I don't know, I always grew up wanting to do a lot of different things in my life. I just felt like, you know, I grew up with 3 older sisters, so even though I'm obviously way too young to have lived through the heart of the 60s, maybe not way too young, but, well, I joked. Actually, I was born in the decade of the beatniks, and then I turned 1, and now I was in the decade of the psychedelic era. So, but because I had older sisters, even though I was a young kid, like single digits, working into the double-digit age throughout the whole like psychedelic 60s and all, my older sisters, especially when my middle sister was like the cool sister, my sister Perry, she's the one who got me into like understanding, you know, what it was to be hip. When I use the word hip now with my kids, they're like, Dad, the fact that you're using the word hip,
it eliminates it. It eliminates it just saying it.
Right, so just to answer your question, so because of that, for some reason I felt like I want to just experience a lot of different lifestyles and a lot of different things. So I've done a ton of part-time jobs through the years, some of them related to what I was doing more than others. But when I lived in San Francisco, I had a job. One of the first jobs I got there was working at an art gallery, compositions in art, glass, and wood. So I was selling. It was kind of cool because I got to check out all the art, and it was glass and wood, which is not the most common mediums. So it was really interesting to be there.
I had a buddy who manufactured terrariums. You mentioned glass and wood, and these were terrariums that I helped make by pasting the little lid on top of one of them. So I was able to go out as a peddler with a whole bunch of terrariums and say, I make these, had a few extras, thought if you were looking for a good wholesale gift, this, that, and the other thing. I wasn't an artist, but the thrill I got from selling art was incomparable. Selling my buddy's stuff.
That's cool, especially if you're getting a commission on it, then it's even more exciting, huh?
Absolutely. You had to look for things to keep you going as a comedian, as a young comedian. I wanted to ask you, what music did you listen to growing up?
Well, similar to the kind of work I did from a young age. Well, I'm ashamed to admit, thanks to my sister Perry, who I mentioned, when I was really young, I still know by heart, I was into Captain and Tennille. I'll admit it. I'll put it out there for a very short time. And my sister was like, no, you cannot be listening to Love Will Keep Us Together. She said, no. We got bands like Yes and Genesis and the Beatles and the Stones. So I flipped off of that pretty quickly. But as a drummer from a relatively early age, I was lucky that I had the God-given gift. I don't consider myself a great drummer, but I would listen to drummers and I'd say, you know what, I can play that. And my dad was nice enough to let me get a drum set. The landlord was not too thrilled about it. And I would just play along with the songs. But then I realized, because I had other musician friends and we used to jam and have fun, I wanted to integrate other styles more and more. So I started getting into reggae and ska and Latin music and across the board. From there, to actually earn a living as a musician, I started doing the wedding and bar mitzvah circuit because, here in the States, trying to get a local band, going is not easy. I would move to Australia if I wanted to do that. In Australia, you could be a local band and do okay and get radio play, but here in the States, you couldn't. So if I wanted to work as a musician, one of the options was wedding and bar mitzvah circuit. So I actually started one little operation with a friend of mine. We didn't have a ton of gigs, but we got a few gigs. So from there, I had to know all the standards. I had to know everything, jazz. I love jazz also. So for me, the more you mix it up, I'm a big fan of mixing things up. So I love when I hear songs where they start off rock and then they have a little like jazzy section, or they switch over to a ska rhythm and then come back. Plus I always, not always, but once I got into the Grateful Dead, and I had roommates in college who they were the guys who had stacks of cassettes of all the different Grateful Dead concerts, and I have the early show in Winterland, second night where they did Scarlet Begonias, and that was their whole lives, was talking about all of that. And the Dead really helped to get me more and more into the idea of it's about the jam and integrating a lot of different styles. So I couldn't say there's one specific style that I like. There's a lot of bands I love. Other bands I may not like, or other music I may not be a huge fan of, but I still love the rhythms and elements of it that you can put into your own music.
Okay, I want to ask you as a drummer, are you familiar with the name, and I bet you are, Elvin Jones?
Sure, Elvin Jones is one of the great jazz musicians of all time.
Well, Elvin Jones...
I might be mistaken. He's your uncle?
No, he wasn't, but he lived in my uncle's building when I was 16. And
really?
I'd visit my uncle just to get away from my parents on a very regular basis. I was not an easy kid growing up.
This sounds like an interview I have to do on you at another time. Maybe we should next time. Maybe I'll interview you when we do this next time. That
would be my pleasure. But I got to ride the elevator with Elvin on many occasions, and he always had sunglasses, and he always smelled like weed. And he couldn't say, I'd walk in with a smile, I go, and he just tried to keep a straight face, because I was a kid, and he doesn't want to throw weed on a kid, not realizing that I could have gotten him high just as easily as him. But
you sure you weren't just catching a little whiff because of the wind of something that was in your own pocket at the time?
Oh, no. He had the good stuff even back then. And so I wanted to give just credit to the Colombians who invaded Jackson Heights in the early 60s and were nice enough to bring weed to my attention for the first time, just off the top of my head.
Interesting. You know what? That's insightful. Jazz musicians certainly have a reputation for that, but you never know for sure just how into it any one given musician is. So that's interesting to know about him, because he's like, this as a drummer. So after, by the way, I was a self-taught drummer for years, and then I said, I bet I can do a lot better and understand the music better if I got a few lessons in. So I took lessons from a great jazz drummer. He's not one of the best known ones, but he played with the Bill Evans Trio. And Bill Evans is one of those, for many, an obscure name in jazz, but he was like the piano player's piano player. Very sad life, though. He became a junkie and had tragedies in his life, but was an unbelievable piano player. And I took some lessons about jazz from one of his drummers in the Bill Evans Trio. And he got me to understand the different patterns. And Elvin Jones was one of the guys who said, if you want to know about, rhythms and cymbals and how to do that, he's the guy to listen to for that. So now it's interesting to see what some of his inspiration might have been. I always noticed he could play a little slower than other jazz musicians that I would listen to. So,
well, that could my explanation could have explained my experience could have be an explanation for him slowing down. Sometimes you got to slow up just to catch up. Slow down to catch up.
I hear you. This is what I love about reggae. Reggae, it breaks the rules of contemporary music in many ways, because you wouldn't even know how to notate some of the things they're doing. when they're doing these weird rhythms where they're just falling off the rhythm and then catching back up, like you said, like how do you even write that down as sheet music? You know, like it's just that's all feel and Rasta splits, the combination of the two.
Do you work out with the drums at all to this day? Do you every now and again go in and
yes and no. I kind of joke, but it's true. Like, I got out of music because I'm a lazy musician. You know, the schlepping around drums and dealing with musicians and having all this equipment to set up and then break down, you know, I wanted to put it all behind me. That's how I got into stand-up. In fact, I was with a band at the time, Moving Parts. No, actually, this was even before Moving Parts. I was with another band called Just Hip, both in San Francisco, where I started opening for the band because I started my hand in a little bit of comedy, and at some point I'm like, yeah, why do I want to be doing this? So I got away from it for a while, and it all backfired on me. And then when I decided to become a rabbi, that's a whole other story. I have to really either thank or blame my wife, depending on the mood I'm in. She's the one who kind of geared me into that direction, which in a way was great because I had all this background. I grew up very religious, so as much as I rebelled against it and ran away from it, this was part of who I was and something that I knew a lot about. And there was a lot that I respected about it throughout my life, even when I ran away from it. But I ended up like running full circle and coming back in. So how it's all backfired on me is now I figured, as a rabbi, even better. I'll show up with like a book and I'm all set. Now, with my wife, she's also a musician. She has a background in doing musical theater and other venues. She did cruise ship work for a while. So now we do these musical services. So now not only am I playing drums again where I got to schlep the drums, I'm setting up the sound system as well. Plus, I have to bring all the Jewish artifacts, the Ark and the Torah and the books. So, like, I keep trying to get away from all the schlepping, and now I'm doing more schlepping than ever.
Okay.
But it all, it helps me to be humble in what I do. I think that's one thing I really try to hold on to is I try not to get too arrogant or full of myself and always continue to walk humbly and realize, there's things I could be doing better. And a lot of things I'm just thankful for that, I was given certain gifts in my life that I don't want to take for granted and I want to do good things with.
What do you pass on to your kids? And what do you deliberately not pass on from your upbringing to your kids?
What do I pass on to my kids? Well, probably impatience is probably on the list. The neurosis and stuff, I leave that to my wife to bring that on to the kid. Well, you know what? It's an interesting question. I try to be a very different father than my father was. And I love my father. He passed away, and he was a tough man to deal with in many ways, but he always did things for the right reasons. I would often joke, I said, my father never wanted to make my life miserable. He did make my life miserable, but it's not that he wanted to. He did it out of a sense of responsibility as a Jewish father. That was his job, was to make my life miserable. And he took it very seriously because he felt he had to keep me on a certain track. So I try to have a different relationship with my kids that is more like that we can talk to each other as, I wouldn't say friends because that's pushing it a little too much, but that we can talk person to person, that it's not always about, a father-son thing. But to also balance that with the fact that, I want to give them a certain amount of respect, and I want them to grow up being the kind of people that are going to respect not just me, but be respectful people of others. I think that's a really important thing in life. Now more than ever, there's so much rage and hatred and opposition within people. And, I think it's a time we got to step back and realize we may not always agree with people, but it doesn't mean we still can't be respectful to them. Because often it gives us rationale for not behaving the way we want to, like, growing up in New York, people would be yelling and screaming. So you want to yell and scream? I'll show you yelling and screaming. So it's like you're finding rationalization for what you're doing. So I've learned there's a difference between being rational and just having rationale for what you're doing. So I try to instill that on my kids to have, a little bit of ownership in what they do. But having said that, I try not to be overly strict with them. I definitely don't force Judaism on them, other than the bar mitzvah. They have to have a bar mitzvah because that was a party in their honor. to show that, they're part of the tribe, as it were. But unlike other Jewish fathers, especially rabbis, I really don't force Judaism on them. There are times I wish I did a little bit more, but for the most part, they come around when they want to be involved with things, and other times I don't feel like I have to shove it down their throats just because that's a choice that I made. Especially I look at the life that I led, I'm like,
Ira,
who am I to tell them?
Other than the Bible, Ira, are there a few books, maybe a bunch of books, that you'd like your kids to read that influenced you as a kid? Other than the Bible.
Kid. Well, the truth is the Bible is a hot and cold thing. There's a lot of troubling things I don't mind denying. I'm not the kind of guy who likes to, sweep things under the rug. I like to take the good with the bad and be honest about it. So the Bible itself, I'll admit there are some passages in the Bible that are really hard to swallow. You try to look at the context that they're in to say, all right, well, this is written for people in those days and this is how they related to the world. But I don't mind admitting that. And I think there's a lot more to life and Judaism and religion, or whatever word you want to call it, the culture, the traditions, than strictly the Bible, because, that it was written so long ago, we're not even completely sure we're translating it right. The language was so different. We're talking thousands of years old. For all we know, everything we think we're translating accurately had a total different connotation or meaning. So they do know their stories, not for breeding, but when they were young, I would tell them like Torah stories before they went to bed. And I'm amazed how much they actually remember a lot of them. As far as books, I admit, it might sound odd coming from a person who's a rabbi. I'm not a huge reader. I do some reading, but I have other ways now more than ever through different videos and seminars and webinars of getting information rather than strictly reading. I'm not sure there's a specific book that I would say changed my life that I want them to read.
Right. Ira, we're running out of time. I want to tell you how much fun it is for me, because I still picture us 30 years ago. And when you say you have a kid, I'm going to ask you this. How old are your children now?
I know, I can't even believe it myself. I still feel like a kid in so many ways, but like, yikes. It's been a while. My older one is 20. He's going to be 21 in April. I can finally kick him out of the house. No, I'm kidding. And my other son is 16.
Wow.
I have a 16-year-old and a 20-year-old. I can't even believe it myself,
This is so cool catching up with you. Thanks for being here. Thanks for coming back.
I got to thank you because, once you get me going, like I feel like I'm just scratching the surface on a few things and the time flies by. That's always my number one criteria. When good things are getting done, the time flies by. Otherwise, the time is dragging on. So I appreciate the time has flown by, and I appreciate you giving me a chance to vent a little bit and share some of my thoughts and bring up some memories that I haven't thought of in a while. But you know what? I would like to interview you. You brought up some interesting things about yourself. And I admit I don't have a whole lot of experience as an interviewer, but maybe we could do a little switcheroo next time. And I'll interview you.
That would be fun. And perhaps you'll consider coming on my network as a podcaster yourself.
Yeah, that's something I would certainly consider. I've been thinking about that. Let's talk off of a podcast about that, because it's something I've thought about, but I've never really taken the time to figure out how to get something going. So maybe we can work something out there.
Beautiful.
And hopefully I'll see you face-to-face soon. I do go up to the Bay Area from time to time. I'll have to look you up, and I more than welcome you and encourage you to look me up when you come down here. I'd love to show you Ira's LA.
Well, I can remember Rodney Dangerfield saying something like, when you're in town, look up my wife. I just came to mind. But thank you again. And thank you to the audience for listening. This is a thrill for me, and I hope it lasts forever. Keep coming back,
Very good, yes.
Ira.
Thank you so much. I look forward to speaking with you again soon. God bless. Take good care.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Happy trails and adios.
Can we still say Happy New Year? It's still within a few weeks. We can still say Happy New Year. I never know what the cutoff is.
Larry David has a thing about New Year's. There's a time it's just nah. He go meh. New Year's Well, I said that already.
Well, New Yorkers, that's like January 2nd. They're already onto that attitude. But out here, it's so awesome, man. So have an awesome New Year, dude.
Yeah, and be cool, dude.
Right on. Awesome. All right, take good care. I look forward to talking to you soon.
All right. Be well,
Bye-bye
everybody. Be well, Ira Rosenfeld, a great guest. Adios.
Thank you.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.